Hello again, folks. We have another topic to discuss with you, and with me here in the studio is Mark Gresham from PSI-PCI, our resident expert here in North Carolina, and we are really honored to have you here discussing these issues with you. Dan, obviously we focused on safety. We want to make sure that these messages get out there, and ultimately our target is the diver, right? We work through the dive center and the dive professionals, but we want to make sure that the diver has a safe and an enjoyable dive. So one of the issues, rather not say issue, but one of the interesting things I see when I'm traveling around doing safety assessments at dive centers, and I haven't told you this yet, but often I look at the filling station and guess what? There's Mark's sticker on the side, meaning he's been there to inspect it, he's installed it. You've had some role to play in guiding folks. So I thought it would be a good topic to use today to talk about some of the shortcomings. Clearly you've been out there and seen a lot of things. Typically what happens, and then what can we do as an industry to be better informed and try to encourage dive businesses when I'm out there talking to them, using your credibility and my words to convince them that there's something they need to do. So maybe to start with, what are the type of things that you see happen, the accidents that happen with filling stations?
Fill whip failures, the little bleeder nuts. I see people tightening those with tools. They're a thumb nut. Use a finger and a thumb to tighten them, or they should be removed from service. We see ruptures of hoses. Fill whip hoses, whether they're steel, rubber, vinyl, they can dismember a human. So the inspection of those fill whips on an annual basis, that's an OSHA requirement, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and it's a good prudent practice, especially like after a season where you have a run into the fall and the summer season's over. It's a great opportunity to inspect your fill whips. The other one is fill whips that are too long. I tell the story, I took over management of a dive center. We had fill whips that were 200 feet long, and we filled your cylinders in the trunk of your car. And the first thing I did was take those hoses off and put them in the dumpster, because it's wholly unsafe to have a fill whip that long. A fill whip that gets loose that's that long can do a lot of damage, and especially injuries to humans.
You've heard them dismember people, yes, it's pretty serious.
Yeah.
We actually had just out of interest, a couple of years ago, one of our partners, one of our chamber partners out in the Caribbean, called me, and I could hear his voice was shaking. It was just before a DEMA show a couple of years ago. And I said, Steve, what's up? Clearly he only phones me when there's something that there's to report. And he was filling a cylinder, standing very close to the filling bank, and it came off on the valve side, in other words on the bank, not on the cylinder. Fortunately for him, it just abraded him, so it took the skin off the side of his face, just missed his eye, got the pictures to show, and then right across his chest. And that was just from the ejection of the gas. He wasn't actually struck. Lost hearing, now permanently in one of his ears. And he was really distraught because he's very conscientious. He buys stuff that is well-made stainless steel, braided filling whips within the 10-year period, properly visually inspected. And we figured out at the end of the day what was the likely cause. Of all the things, a little bit of Irish bad luck, if you can call it that. But the amount of energy is huge. And when you mentioned to me 200 feet, I mean, when I'm out there in the field, if it's longer than 3 meters or say 10 feet, I'm already getting nervous trying to tell people they should secure their whips. And that's one of the things they don't know about. But okay, so those are the filling whips. What else do you see on these filling? I mean, we look at the panel and their valves and all sorts of things over there, and one wonders, have they made some modifications themselves? Is this how it was made by the original manufacturer?
That's an excellent point. What happens is over time, fill stations morph into something they weren't designed to do. Over time, we need more fill whips. So we add a T here and an elbow there, and we add filling whips that are attached to where filling whips are attached. So there's no mechanism for them to shut off. And if you have a fire, for example, in one nitrox cylinder with no backfill limiting, that can loop through your system very, very quickly and cause other cylinders to fail and or fill whips to fail, even if there are not cylinders attached. That's happened numerous times since I've been working at PSI. The other one is fill whips that are too short. Well, they take our information and take it quite literally. And a fill whip that's very short, it gets broken at the ferrules because it's too short, so we pull on it and we pull on it and we pull on it.
Right?
Or we bend it or we twist it. So keep fill whips, as Francois recommends, something in the neighborhood of 3 meters as a long hose. So short as a short is practiced, or a short is practicable, but just don't make them too short so you pull on them. Don't make them too long because they're a whipping hazard.
Yeah. And if they are long, what I always say is that they need to be supported or
Yes.
perhaps put in a conduit or somewhere
Correct.
and made safe. Okay, so we've spoken about the whips and you know, the interesting thing for me is you go to a very busy dive center down in the Keys, very corrosive in this seawater. There we do use a lot of stainless steel. We should be using a bit more brass and other alloys, but we see rust everywhere.
Correct.
Okay, and we know that the ferrule at the end, it might be part stainless steel, but there's always going to be some connection that's carbon steel and it rusts. And what do you normally say to these dive centers when you go there and you can see corrosion and rust and weeping down the side of the panel, gauges that are broken, correct, labels that are no longer in place?
Often.
And you know, how do you manage to convince that dive operator that he's dealing with he's exposing his workers to an incredibly hazardous environment?
Well, I think as professionals, you've exposed owners and dive store owners, managers, guys that are filling stations. You expose them to this and say, hey, this is a bad practice. Now, I was told many years ago, you're not in the enforcement business, which we're not. We're in the information and education business. So educate the customer. What I find interesting, as you really astutely described, a fill whip is almost perfect, except for that one ferrous fitting, because they didn't have the right fitting, so they grabbed any fitting and installed it in the system. Think about rust particulates in a nitrox filling whip, and that's quite detrimental. So it's the sum of the parts. So I know I have a deficiency because that's the way I had to install it at the time, but make a plan to solve the issue by making them all stainless. And as you astutely say, brass is a better choice than stainless steel, especially with high pressures of oxygen.
Well, certainly with oxygen, when the pressure maybe is 2,500 PSI, but very high pressure stuff, we know we need to use stainless steel.
Right.
And stainless steel has its advantages and its disadvantages.
Absolutely.
And one disadvantage is it misthreads very easily, and people think they've tightened a joint, meanwhile it hasn't been tightened. So perhaps, you know, just some basic guidance to a dive operator. You know, once a year you should inspect, you should look for leaks. If you see corrosion, you should be cleaning it. You should perhaps every couple of years have somebody come in and service it for you. Be aware of any rust and particulates that you might see coming out of the hoses. And again, Mark, as I keep saying to folks, secure the ends of your hoses.
Exactly.
It's a $15 whip restraint.
Exactly.
And if you have one where the cylinder is attached and one where the valve is attached, if it does come apart, you'll hear a loud noise, but at least you're unlikely to be the recipient of an axe-like whip rupture. Just one other thing I'd like to add, and I don't want to be controversial now, this is just one of my pet peeves. So you have a mixing panel, and most dive shops tend to have this kind of belief that if I have a gauge and it's filled with a fluid, it's really the right gauge to have. And now they're dealing with a nitrox mixing panel, which they don't regard as oxygen, and they have a gauge and it's got liquid in it. And I always say to them, you know, what's worse than a gauge that's filled with liquid? It's a gauge that was filled with liquid, where the level's below where it was, and there's no sign of it weeping down the panel. It tells me it's gone into the pipe, and you just need some oxygen, and they normally use glycerin, as you know.
And glycerin, glycerin is the fly in the ointment. Having an oil-filled gauge or a glycerin-filled gauge that's not compatible with oxygen, and then you identify a leak. Well, where's the glycerin going? Where's the oil going? Well, you've put it in all your customer cylinders, or you've run it through your entire plumbing system, and then you run high pressures of oxygen through there, and the outcome can be very catastrophic. But it's all preventable.
Maybe just to give a little bit of kind of, I won't say an excuse, but where we would use them is on the compressor, because of the vibration on the compressor. You'd expect the final pressure gauge before the filter system to be liquid filled, and they need to be pay attention to the level of the liquid. But if it was to rupture at that stage, it would be caught in the filter system.
Right.
But as you know, you go there and you see a compressor, and the dive shop owner is so proudly showing me everything that he has, and there's a gauge that isn't working, or gauge that's, or the liquid's leaked out. You know, you'd think it's kind of a no-brainer. You really hit a very important point there about enforcement. We're not going to enforce safety into the industry. That's a punishment. In fact, the biggest enforcement is the lawsuits that follow. Our job is to make people aware of the risks. If they're doing something really stupid, you know, we need to stand up and say, look, for your own benefit, these are the things that could happen. But, and certainly from a Dan point of view, we're not the scuba police. And people often come to us and say, I've seen this at a dive shop, what are you going to do about it? And my only answer is, my team, we know is, well, what we can do is talk to the dive shop owner, but not to go and threaten them, but just to explain. Or we'll write an article, do a webinar, try to get that information out there without being personal. So thank you, Mark. As I said, I see your sticker up on many of the fill panels, so I kind of know what to expect in terms of build quality. Sadly, it's not always the case, and really busy dive shop owners should pay attention to their filling stations. So that's what we have to share with you today, and look forward to another one of our broadcasts. We should be back fairly soon. Okay.